Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to our second webinar in the series of the Rise of the Robots. This seminar, or webinar rather, is entitled Process Independence Day. And I'd like to welcome everyone that's joined the session today, wherever you are. And I see some very special guests amongst the attendees. Amongst a number of the attendees, I can see quite a lot of Twofold customers, and I'd like to give an extra special welcome to all of those Twofold customers. Thank you very much for joining us. So today we're talking about Process Independence Day, 4th of July. Crikey, all those years ago, back in, what was it, 1776, the Americans had their Independence Day, where they freed themselves of the tyranny of the British Empire. And today's focus is how we can free ourselves of the tyranny of boring, mundane, repetitive tasks or processes that you have to do in your business. So that's what I mean by Process Independence Day. So as I said, this is the second part of the seminar or webinar Rise of the Robots. Don't worry, I'm not that particular Borg-like robotic face. But the first session, should you have missed it, it's a 30-minute webinar, and it's available on our website as a recording for you to download and listen to at your heart's content. This session will also be recorded and will be available from later today for you also to download and share with your colleagues. And we're very glad that you're here live. But should you need to step away for any moment, don't worry, everything is being recorded and you can catch up with what's being said. So I don't know, based on all of the people that are attending this webinar, where you individually are in your own journey towards process independence. What I do know, though, is that typically you're going to need to bypass a couple of very important steps or hurdles before you become truly independent. The first stage is you're going to need to digitize your processes. You know, if you've got paper documents or emails with business documents coming in, you're going to need some form of automation that can read and understand and translate those documents into transactions that your back-end systems can process. And once you can understand the context of your content, you can then start to apply robots and robotic processes to start automating those tasks. And then at that point, you become truly free. And once you're free, once you've achieved process independence, it's at that point you can really start to concentrate on improving customer experience, or just as important, your staff's experience, your colleagues' experience. How good is it to work within your organization? And once you're free of the legacy of the past, once you're free of the mundanity of a lot of the jobs that people have to perform, at that point, your organization can start thinking about, well, how do we add more value to our customers? Or how do we start new business models? How do we start being agile and rapidly adapting to the environment within which we find ourselves? So as I say, I don't know where you are on that journey, but I want to get you up to Process Independence Day by allowing you to automate a number of those difficult to make more efficient processes that you run within your organization. So the agenda we're running through in this particular webinar is we'd like to define the success for rolling out robotic process automation. In our last webinar, we had a look at the marketplace and we overviewed the types of technologies and the types of tasks and activities at a high level. Now we're going to get really granular. We're going to get deep and dirty on these processes and understand exactly what robots are good for and how we should define success for what it is that they're about to achieve. And even in more detail, we're going to have a look at one of the vendors out there that provides robotic process automation, and we're going to have a look at the Kofax Kapow product. We're going to have a look at why that might have some strategic advantages over others that are available. And from the whole session, we're then going to wrap it up with some conclusions and takeaways. And please now, as we're actually running through the webinar, start thinking of the questions that you'd like to be answered and send them through, and we'll attempt a full question and answer session at the end of the webinar today. So let's kick in with defining success for robotic process automation. Now, I wrote a blog recently on LinkedIn, and it's strange how year on year business priorities seem to be very similar. They perhaps change in terms of order of priority, and sometimes new vogue things come along. But many of the challenges are actually across all organizations, irrespective of what vertical or industry or what service or products it is that you provide. Many of us are looking at how we within our organization lower operational costs. How do we eliminate risks? How do we stop things going wrong? And just as importantly, how do we make sure that we're compliant within the frameworks of the rules and regulations of the industry or the country or countries that we operate in? How do we make sure we stay out of jail and make sure that we operate in a compliant way? And I guess, one of the real focuses that I'm increasingly seeing in terms of people's priorities is how do we improve the customer experience? How do we operationally transform ourselves to be able to respond to people 24/7 in a way and a manner that allows them to interact with your organization or your department within the organization in a way that's appropriate to them, easy for them, but still gets done everything that you need to have achieved. And if you can do that, yes, you can enable new business models, but you may have other challenges. It's not for me to know your business. You'll know what your particular challenges are. So how should success be measured when deploying software robots? By the way, if you want a definition of software robots, all of those are covered in the previous webinar. Please go to the website and watch the first session where we detail that thoroughly for you. Well, I think it's really important to have some very stringent and rigorous criteria by which you are going to measure success. Fundamentally, if you're looking to lower operational costs, well, then at the end of the deployment, you need to understand what the robots have done for your business in terms of hard and cold return on investment. And I guess one of the other things you really need to understand to derive that figure is you need to understand the total cost of ownership. And as we'll see, not all robots are created equally. And sometimes people just consider the cost of software or licenses or services in order to make those robots become live. But I think critical right up front is you need to understand the infrastructure, because some robots require a huge amount of cost in order for them to run. So I think if you understand the total cost of ownership, you can then see the benefit that those robots are bringing back to you. And I'm going to share some really nice case studies in a moment. Some of them are a repeat from the previous webinar, and some of them are new just for today. But you know that if you've been compliant, and you know that you've given a great experience if you've got a great reputation. And it's hard to measure. Do you look at net promoter scores? Are you doing satisfaction surveys? Are you not in the press for all the wrong reasons? But you need to have measurements in terms of what your reputational standing is and how robots are helping you maintain or improve that within the marketplace that you operate. And ultimately, I guess one of the hardest things that we hear from our customers is, how do I measure the operational efficiency of people that work for me? I've got a guy working in marketing, and he's responsible for the website. How do I measure his operational efficiency? And I guess that those measurements are hard, but it's very easy once you start to deploy robots to understand exactly how a robot can move one content management system website to another and not hurt any humans as it moves that data across, and do it 100% effectively. So, have measurements for that, understand what productivity is before and after the deployment of robots. And if that's something you struggle with, I'd be delighted to share with you some amazing tools that actually monitor and benchmark your productivity and performance. We've got some amazing tools that, never having seen your transactional data before, can be loaded, and within a minute or a couple of minutes actually to start to show you where your process bottlenecks are. And I'd be delighted to share that with anyone. Oh, I've already got a question. Yes, we'll take a note of those. We'll come back to you and share that with you afterwards. And I guess another key for success is understanding what level of straight-through processing or automation you have within your business. Now, at a high level, the industry analysts would tell us that you should expect from deploying robots to increase your capacity of between 35 and 50%. Well, we'll blow those numbers away in some of the case studies we'll talk about in a minute. But, as an average measurement, that's not a bad one to go by. Increase capacity by 35 to 50%. Deliver 25 to 50% in annual savings. Deliver 100% in data accuracy. Eliminate errors. Slash processing times by between 30 and 50%. These are really, I guess, good initial goals, although I think you'll see we've seen some significant enhancements on that. In the last webinar, we looked at an electronics firm that I inadvertently thought had saved an individual 850 hours per month, which, I worked out very quickly was actually 35 days in a 31-day month. But it was quickly pointed out to me that was across multiple people. And I'm kidding. I actually knew it was across multiple people. But, another large global business, they deployed software robots. Now, get this statistic. I'm not going to labor it, the case study in this webinar. You can go and see the other one. But they saved their employees between 90 to 95% of their time. Crazy. Imagine that. 90 to 95% of your time given back to you because robots are doing some of that work, or in this case, the majority of the mundane, boring, repetitive work that perhaps you had to do with your old role, and now you're freed up to add value. We looked at a global logistics business that could track 1,000% more shipments by logging on to partner portals, going to ports and carriers and government agencies, and logging in and retrieving documents and bills of lading, seeing where their particular shipments were, or their particular cargoes were, so that they're able to respond to customers 1,000% more responsive than they had been before. And a global insurer called this stuff, he said it processed documents or processes automagically. So we've got a few more case studies for this webinar this afternoon. And the reason I've chosen these three is one person came back to us after the last webinar and said they worked for a bank. Did we have any case studies for a bank? Well, I like responding to questions, so I'm going to give you three. This is the first. So this was a global European bank, and they used robots to help them in the compliance area of their business. First of all, they used it to help them with their Know Their Customer process, their KYC, Know Your Customer, or CDD, Customer Due Diligence process. And this, within their organization, used to take between 13 to 20 minutes to go and check various different background or back-end systems within their organization, but also punch out to external data providers and portals to see if this was a bona fide individual, or indeed someone that they wanted to have as a customer of their organization. And that used to take a huge amount of work. It meant they had the effort and they weren't necessarily as responsive as they could be to their customers. And that's now been slashed using robots. We have another multinational European bank, and they were using robots across their organization. They deployed 50 robots for a whole bunch of processes. But the thing I loved about their deployment is they actually built some robots that allowed them to build and deploy more robots. Now that's starting to sound like Terminator territory, Skynet, where robots start building robots. But don't worry, they were just using it to allow them to create new environments for within which they could scale and roll out robotic process automation across their organization. And another top 10 global bank. These figures are just astounding if you start comparing some of the technologies that are out there. They built 80 robots within 6 months of having the technology, and they used it for a wide range of across their business, integrating into their core banking systems and various back-end systems that were deployed from mainframes over Citrix. And those departments were loan processing, trade finance, foreign exchange, again, global Know Your Customer processing, and customer due diligence and account services. So huge numbers of success stories, far more than I've got time to concentrate on today. But if you'd like to understand the benefits of robots, and more specifically what it could do for your industry, again, reach out to me after the webinar and I'll dig out some case studies in your industry, because we've got many hundreds of customers that we can refer to share with you. So I guess the highlight that we kind of shared in the last webinar, and I'd like to bring everyone on this session up to speed with, is the technology that we're looking at today has been around for years. It might be a millennial, it was around the turn of the millennium, but this technology has been around for 20 years. It's mature, it's robust, it's scalable, and it works. And typically, especially if you start looking at technology from an organization like Kofax, most of the customers here, customers would have an average of 100 or more robots in production. Many have over 1,000. Several have got over 10,000. And I think the largest customer has over 30,000 robots in production. And it's important to know that this technology came from and is part of an overall process automation space. And that becomes critical, as you see, in terms of where it fits in the overall platform that I'll share with you later on. So where do you typically deploy robotic process automation? What kind of processes can you use it for? Well, you already know your organization, and you know those big systems, if you're insurance, those policy or claim systems, if you're in banking, your core banking systems, you'll know that your IT teams have already built integrations for those core systems. What I'm talking about is using robots to allow you to integrate and automate the hundreds of other different systems and processes that you have across your organization. The ones that just aren't big enough or just will never get attention from IT to solve those issues. So it's the hundreds or thousands of other things that you do in your organization. That's where you should deploy robots. So how do you understand if a process is right for a robot? So, how do you assess its suitability, and how do you start building up the roadmap for which processes you are going to automate? And I guess I've got these 8 stages that I guess I'd wish you to consider. And again, we can go through this in more detail with you individually later on after the webinar. But I guess as a simple rule of thumb, is the process that you're doing rules-based and repetitive? Is a human making a decision based on their knowledge and experience? Well, that's going to use more cognitive or AI-based robotics. And in many cases, you're still going to need a human to make a decision. But if what you're doing is cutting and pasting information from a portal and putting it in a spreadsheet, that's perfect for a robot. It's rule-based and it's repetitive. Is the information that you're getting or moving it to structured? Do you have enough volume to make it worthwhile building a robot? Or, does that volume come through peaks and troughs? And what we don't want to have to do is, at a certain part of the year where we get a huge influx of additional work, we don't want to have to take on loads of people and have to train them or let the quality slip because we're dealing with lots of temps in our process. Or do we need to do, activities for our customers or our staff out of our typical hours? We're not a 24/7 organization, but we need to be responsive within those hours. They're perfect for robots, as is a process that is prone to human error. Huge amounts of tasks in the accounting and finance area where you're preparing schedules and journals and updating spreadsheets. Accountants and people that work in finance are fastidious. They're very, very focused and organized people, but we're all human beings. We all typically can make mistakes, and robots don't. They will do things 100% accurately, 100% of the time. And if you go through those 6, then you've got the ability to build a business case. If as I'm going to later on, you can build a robot in 10 minutes at no additional license cost and no infrastructure cost for your organization, and that robot will save you 4 hours a day, a week, a month, well, then it's a very easy business case to sign off. If a robot's going to cost you tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds to buy, build, and put into an infrastructure and roll out, well, then you've got a very different business case in terms of how you should use it. But I guess one of the key things is you should also look at from robots is that you should have no development or optimization of that robot once it goes out. If that process isn't constantly changing or being updated, then again, it's a perfect candidate for a robot. If that process is constantly changing, then you'll constantly be having to update the robot to work with it. And robots have their own challenges. Some of the technologies that you can look at out there have struggle with understanding what robots are doing. Some technologies have you deploying robots in virtual machines, and we've got one customer that have hundreds of virtual machines. One had 300 laptops running in racks, running robots in them. And how on earth do you understand what each of those virtual machines are doing? How do you know if those machines are actually operating and are able to perform their functions correctly? And do your robots need to take advantage of external providers of artificial intelligence or machine learning to understand the document or make a decision? Or is that already baked in, and the better technologies, all of that would be baked in within the core platform itself? Because, you need to understand, does that robot need to be built using code? Because otherwise you're going to have delays caused by testing and debugging. Can it actually understand documents? I want to process a spreadsheet, or I want to understand an email that's coming in and process the contents of that. Well, then I need that robot to be able to understand what is in that email. Is that the right document? And what do I need to do with it to process it onward within my organization? And how do I scale it and move it out across the organization? And just as importantly, when does a robot need to stop and hand over and ask a human to get involved? So that's, I guess, the first main area of the 5 that I want to cover. Let's now, in a bit more detail, understand how customers achieve results using the Kofax Kaplow platform. So Kofax would claim that the typical benefits of their platform is that it's going to allow you to accelerate your business transformation. It's going to allow you to lower your cost per automation. It's going to allow you to create business leverage for large-scale operations, enable you to have crucial visibility of what's going on and deliver best economic value. They're lofty claims, and I'd like to really dig into it in a bit more detail, perhaps in 5 further levels of detail, to see if indeed we can achieve those benefits and perhaps build a robot live in front of you in the session this afternoon. So how do we build those better results? Let's get into those 5 areas. The first one, and I think perhaps one of the most important, is you need a technology that is interactive and has no code. Why? Code needs coders. Coders are expensive. Code needs debugging. If you've got an interactive no-code design environment, then you, the user that understands your process, are the same people that can build robots to solve your own problems. And that's absolutely critical in terms of the rollout. Now, if we look at the Kaplow solution from Kofax, then it has the ability to do that, typically in most projects, completely codeless, irrespective of the information or systems that it needs to interact with. You may want to interact with data files, XML. You may want it to read emails or work with Excel. And not open up applications, not take over a machine that has Excel running on it, or Exchange running on it, or Edge, or Internet Explorer, or Chrome, or whatever your preferred browser is, but the robot can run that natively within its own environment. So it can punch out to portals, it can run terminal services to run in mainframes, it can read PDF documents and link to databases, and do all of that without a single virtual machine being generated. And yes, if you do have some desktop applications that need to be run, then yes, of course we can take over virtual machines, but do that from the server in a command and control way. Because if you can do that, then you've got a live interactive environment without scripting. It's easy to test and debug robots, and most importantly, you can deploy them faster. We went to see a customer recently in the media industry, and just over 12 months, 3 people had built over 3,148 robots. You can only build that scale of robots if they're easy to deploy and easy to implement. But if they are easy to deploy and implement, then you empower the business, because when someone says, "Can you?" you say, "Yes, I can. Let me build it for you now." I had this with a colleague recently who wanted to have a robot build and check DVLA information around driving licenses. And in front of them, I built a robot in less than 5 minutes that had the ability to punch out and go and get that information. And once you've built a robot, technology like that from Kaplow allows you then to call that robot that had no code in it, but as a service, maybe as a web service, maybe as an API, for whatever it is that you're doing, linking into, banking for screening, or policy administration for insurance, or sales commission, whatever your process is. It allows us to create synthetic APIs. I'll show you one of those live because they're much easier to see than they are to explain exactly what they do. But you should look for technology like Kofax that has an interactive no-code design environment. Equally important, you need to have a centralized bot execution from the server. What on earth does that mean? Let me break that down for you in a bit more detail. So, as I kind of tried to hint at earlier, Kofax and Kapow can run things from the server. I'm going to do that for you in a moment. I'm going to work on a spreadsheet. I'm going to work on Internet Explorer, and I'm not going to link to any virtual machine. And just about all the other vendors out there would require a virtual machine to be running that has the browser, the Excel sheet, the desktop application, or whatever it is that you're trying to do running on it. And then the robo server or the robot orchestrator would take over that virtual machine. Well, that's a huge cost. Just imagine hundreds of virtual machines running hundreds of robots in production, and you have to have a similar amount in pre-prod and a similar amount in test and dev. Just think of those server costs, the storage costs to have all those virtual machines, the licenses across all of those environments that you'd need to have, and the administrative overhead. What a complete nightmare that model must be to have to try and deploy and scale across your organization. And that's why we've seen a huge number of organizations try robotic process automation, go down the route of trying to do it across virtual machines per robot, and then just never leave the proof of concept phase, because the cost or the fear of rolling that out into production just becomes incredibly scary. Let's contrast that with Kofax. If you've got websites that you need to interact with, or portals, no virtual machines are needed. If you need to access email, Excel, or mainframes, no virtual machines are needed. If you need to access databases or data or file systems, no virtual machines are needed. And yes, if you've got a specific line of business application that you'd like to automate and replicate the keystrokes of what your humans are doing, well, then we can interact with that, but we'll do that in a far more elegant way with a very light agent that just runs on that machine in an attended or unattended mode. So, maybe an agent starts to complete a process and they press a function key and the robot completes 10 things, both within their application and maybe 4 or 5 other back-end applications. So that agent doesn't have to do that. But we're able to deploy robots with significantly fewer virtual machines. So with fewer virtual machines, that's a lower infrastructure cost. It's faster to deploy, and we don't care where you deploy it, whether you want to do that on-prem or in the cloud, or a combination of both. But if you're looking for robotic process automation to scale and be at a low cost, you absolutely fundamentally must not just look at the tool, you must look at how it gets deployed and what infrastructure is required, because that's critical to the final total cost of ownership. So I guess before I get into a live demonstration, is you should perhaps also look for something that has superior automation for web-based applications. Because increasingly, if your desktop application presents itself via the web, well, then we don't even need a virtual machine for that. We'll just use the web interface to automate our interactions with that web application. And the tool we're about to look at, Kapow from Kofax, has its own embedded web browser. So you don't need a machine running, as I said, Chrome, Internet Explorer, Edge, or Firefox, etc. You can punch out to websites, web applications, web portals, either within your business or up and down your supply chain to interact with your partners and customers in a highly automated way. So I'm halfway through the webinar, and I guess at that point, we really should start looking at building a robot. Now, those of you that know me, the Twofold customers, know that I love giving presentations, and I love seeing people, and I love seeing how they're reacting to the presentation that I'm giving. And when I've got a webinar, I don't get any of that feedback, and I don't know how you're all looking at the moment. I can just imagine that perhaps you're all looking a bit like this out there. I really hope you're not. I hope you're not. feeling tired. But if you are, then now's the perfect time to have a quick snort of that strong coffee that you've got next to you. There's a recent medical report that said coffee is incredibly good for you. But if another one comes out next week that says it isn't, I deny all knowledge of making that claim. But let's now start looking at and building a live robot. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my mouse and have a look at a particular task that I need to perform. So what I have on the right hand side is a website, and within this website, if I go down to a particular page, it's got some information on this website that I need to extract and put into a spreadsheet. But this website on the right hand side could be one of your applications, and this spreadsheet on the left hand side could be another one of your systems internally, or it could be a customer system or a partner system. I don't care what these two applications are, or indeed how many of them are, but for my demonstration, what I'm going to replicate is that poor task that someone has to do on a regular basis of punching out and finding out what the stock price is from this particular indices and copying it and perhaps pasting it into a spreadsheet. You know, if you've got boring and repetitive, mind-numbing tasks like that, I'm so sorry that you have to do that, but trust me, you're going to love this technology because it's going to eliminate that from you. So because I'm going to do Excel within the robot itself, I'm going to close down that spreadsheet because I don't need to interact with it. And because I'm going to use this website, I am just going to take a copy of the URL of this particular website because the robot is going to interact with it later. So here's the design environment of building a robot, and the robot's called Process Independence Robot, and there's nothing in it. So those of you that watched the previous webinar, you saw me create a step before of a snippet, and that snippet put in the opening up and handling of an Excel sheet, all of these particular steps. Well, today I'm not going to cheat. I'm actually going to start from scratch and build this robot as if I've not done any of the work before. So it's an incredibly simple and intuitive environment. The files that I interact with are down the left-hand side. Across the top is a workflow or a flow diagram of the robot, and as I interact with Excel and websites, you'll see it grow and build in front of you. In the middle is a what you see is what you get environment, and on the right hand side is just the variables data or the drop down actions that I interact with. So the first thing I need to do is open up the spreadsheet. So I'm going to do that by loading a page, and I do that by tapping in the location of this particular spreadsheet, and it's in the kapow test directory, and it's called stock, I mistyped it, stock.xlsx. And if I had mistyped it, don't worry, the robot would have checked and prevented an error happening. But if I now move on, you can see that Excel is actually loading that data into our robot design environment, which is fantastic. So what I can now do to take it away from Excel is say, I want to open that as a Excel variable, and I want to work on it later on. So I've loaded it as a variable into my robot, and I'm now just going to open that variable so that I can work on it. So I'm not now working on Excel at all. I'm working on a robotic version of Excel, which means I can interact with any number of spreadsheets and then just write the results back to the spreadsheet at the end of the building of this robot. So here I am working on this data. So I've opened the spreadsheet. The first thing I want to do is I just want to name this top row, because later on I'm going to look up the names of these stock indices and put the data within them based on their name. So very, very simple. I've just inserted it in the wrong location. Apologies, I could have moved it, but I'll just start again. So I'm just going to set it as a named range, and within that naming, what I'm going to do is, rather than do it automatically, just so that you can prove that I've done it, I'm going to call it PI, standing for Process Independence, and I'll call it PI header information. So there we go. I've called that Process Information header. The next thing that I want to do is I want to insert a new line. So I want to modify this spreadsheet, and I want to insert a row at the end of the spreadsheet, just one row, so that every time I come and write information, it inserts a new row. Look, it's done it. That's how hard it is, or isn't. It's incredibly simple and straightforward. And now I've started to do that, I can start interacting directly with this spreadsheet. So I'll go into this particular cell, and I now want to set the contents of this cell, and I want it to be today's date or today's time. So I'm just going to use an expression, and I'm going to say put in now, and maybe I want that as DDMMYYY. In terms of day, month and year. But if I didn't want that, you saw how easy it was to put that in. I could choose whatever format I want to. And then when I press OK, bang, look, it's put the day, month and year in that spreadsheet. So that's fantastic. That's all I need to do. So now I need to start interacting with my web page. And just before I do that, I'm just going to introduce a branch, because once it's finished taking the data from the website and popping it into Excel, I want it to finish. And within a branch, the second stage, I wanted to then write this file back to an Excel spreadsheet. So we've put the date in there. Now what I want to do is go and open up that particular web page. So what I'm going to do is just cut and paste. I could do a load page action if I want to, or I could just put the URL into the browser view, and it's gone and put it down here. So I'll just move it to the right location. Excuse me, that's me rushing ahead of myself. If I go to this location, I'll do it the other way. It's just as easy. I'll just insert a step here. Just go to this location, and I'll insert a step before, and it's an action step. And I'll just do a load page, and I'll put in the URL and press enter. And then by moving on, can you see that now here's that web page? Really simple. And the action's called load page. And if I wanted to go to that particular finance page, if I just double click it with a mouse, look, the robot's built it. It said click finance. Fantastic. Now I'm in this page, and I want to start extracting the information from, it looks to me like a table, and I want the second row. I don't want the first row, I want the second row and any other rows that are in this particular table. Now, I don't know if you know HTML or HTML code, but what I could do, if I click in somewhere in the code, is I could scroll up until I see the code, the tag, the XML tag or the HTML tag for table, and I could click on it, and it selects this table in this web page. But you might not be a coder, so don't worry if you're not a coder. Look, I'll just click anywhere in the table, and then I'll go out tag, outer tag, outer tag until I've done exactly the same thing. I've selected that table. And what I want to do is I want to loop through these rows, excluding the top row. So I'm going to loop through this table row, excluding the first row. Look how simple that was. I now have built a loop step. And if I click next, 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 it scrolls through my web page. Amazing. Now I'm going to speed up because everything's really simple. So I want to extract this particular text for the indices name, and I'm going to extract it to a variable called stock, and I'm going to extract the price, which is a number, and I'm going to extract it to a variable called stock price, and I could reformat it if I want to, but I'm happy that I've extracted the symbol, and I'm happy that I've extracted the price. So now all I need to do is go and pop that into the Excel spreadsheet. Fantastic. So I'll go back to the Excel spreadsheet, and because I was in Shanghai, I'll go into Shanghai, and I want to set the contents of this cell using the variable that I created called stock price. Click OK. And look, it's going to put the stock price in there. Fantastic. So the only thing I'm just going to do is, rather than do it 4 more times, is I'm just going to go into that step and use something called a finder and say, look up the table row, or look up the row called process independent, say header. Where you see Shanghai, put the Shanghai stock indice price. Where you see Nikkei, put that information in. So I'll do that. So I'll change it from doing it by index to header, and I'll change it to the PI header, and what I want to look up is the variable of stock symbol. That's it. I've now built this particular part of the robot, and it puts the information in, and as I now scroll through, look, it's starting to put the information into this robot. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you for that. So the final thing I need to do is just write this robot out to an Excel file. So I'll insert a step before. It's an action step. and I go to the action step options, and this time I want to, it's a file system. So I go to the file system action and I want to write a file, and guess what? I'm going to write it back to the same location that that Excel sheet was. So it's C:\/ kapow underscore test / stock.xlsx. Now, those of you that know me will absolutely laugh when I heard that I was going to be building a robot on this webinar, because you know that I am the most technical numpty person that you can come across. And here I am building a robot in front of you without writing a single line of code. So I'm now writing that file back out to the file system. And we need to just put some information into it. So I'm just going to put the variable of Excel in there. And I've now completed my robot. So it goes to Excel, opens up an Excel sheet, goes to the web and starts putting information in there. Let's actually test it, and let's go into a debug mode and actually run the robot. So we'll run it through, and bang, it's opening up the spreadsheet, it's opening up the web page, it's putting the information into the spreadsheet, and it's run through. Let's try it again. Let's run the robot for a second time. And bang, that's running through. And then let's run it for a third time, and bang, it's running up and running through. And if that's completed 3 times, if I now go back to my Excel spreadsheet and open it up, look at that. That robot has now put 3 lines of data into my spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet was all set to graph those. And it's gone out to an external system, perhaps that it had never seen before, or an internal system, and it started moving data between them and bringing you up to date with information. So that's awesome. That robot now works. That's absolutely fantastic. So the final thing I'm going to do with this robot is I'm going to promote it to a live environment. We might talk about this later on in terms of who and why and when you should do this, but I'm going to promote this robot up to live. I'm going to pop it up onto the server, and then I'm going to have a look at it on the server. And here we go. We can see the robot has now been promoted to live. So there's the one called Process Independence. There's last week's one called Webinar. And now this Process Independent robot is there, and I can create a schedule for it to run. Do I want it to go and do that every minute, every second, every hour, once a day? Or do I want it to do it based on a condition? And that condition might be an email's arrived that's asking me to do something, or a status in your back-end system gets updated, or a record goes to a particular state, and then that robot runs. However you want to trigger it, or maybe it's a keyboard shortcut on your particular keyboard, and you get to a certain part, and then you want the robot to take over, and you press, I don't know, function F8, and then the robot takes over and performs another task. But I've now built that robot, and without writing a single line of code, and I think this is the magic part. Look at this. If I now click this API button, that robot that runs all of those actions is now available as either Java code or as C# code that I can cut and paste and put in any one of your applications, and you can now call that robot to run automatically. Whether that's Java, as I say, C#, or whether you want it as a RESTful or as a SOAP service, you can now call that robot and action it from any one of your back-end systems. That's amazing. I don't know how to write code, and yet I've now just built a robot that creates a full integration into any one of your back-end systems without knowing how to write a single line of code. So that's how robots should be: easy to write and easy to work with. So hopefully no one is looking like that, and we'll finish off the last part of the webinar, the last quarter of the webinar. So I guess it's just as important, once you've built robots, to understand how they're performing. And tools like Kapow from Kofax come with comprehensive, pre-built, interactive webinars, interactive dashboards. Okay, I'm just being told by a colleague that my voice isn't coming through. Oh, it's come back. Fantastic. So apologies if we had a dropout of voice there. Those of you that were there trying to make it happen, well done. But we broke that particular gremlin, and we're back online again. So you can hear me again. So what I was saying was, it's really important, once you've built, imagine if you've got 10,000 robots on the server, how on earth do you understand if they're performing correctly and how they're working? And by the way, the robot that I built was the happy path. I didn't build in there any error traps, and I'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later on. What happens if the Excel sheet wasn't there? What happens if the internet was down, as we just happened there and my voice went? But you can build all of those error traps in robots. So if the internet did go down, and perhaps you couldn't hear me, the robot could have known to tell me to stop talking for a minute until everything caught back up again. So the beauty of tools like Kapow from Kofax is they come with pre-built dashboards that are configurable, but will automatically show you how many times things have executed, if there are errors or issues, and most importantly, show you the intelligence of how your processes are being improved, even down to where particular activities are within the process. And these reports are generated again without a single line of code, even having the ability to produce swim lanes so that you can see effectively where processes are taking the happy path, or where perhaps they've had to take alternative paths, or where perhaps if people have had to get involved. And this is a great candidate for seeing which processes to automate. So analytics are available out of the box as an option for you. And I guess the final area, and we often get asked this, is how much is it, or how does it compare to other vendors? And I guess the key thing to note here is perhaps how other vendors price and deliver their robotic offerings. What we see in the marketplace is there is a fixation of having a per robot license, and that robot is licensed at all times, irrespective of whether it's being used or not. You have to build, as we said before, a virtual machine, and that virtual machine has a robot in it, and you'll need a robot in production and a robot in pre-prod and a robot in test and dev. And that robot's not available to be freed up again. You've got to buy that license, and then you've got to buy the professional services, days, weeks or months, from a management consulting firm, or go on weeks and months of training, or have teams of developers internally to start rolling that robot out. Well, Kofax is different. So yes, there is a per robot cost, but that robot is concurrent. The robot is only being used whilst an activity is running through it. So that robot that you saw me build, that took, what was it, 2 or 3 seconds, uses a concurrent license for 2 or 3 seconds, and then gives that concurrent license back to 100 or 1,000 other robots to call on and use and build. So you can have a highly economical way of deploying robots across your organization. Those licenses are released and given back, available. And you know, if you want to run robots simultaneously, then yes, you can buy multiple robots. But if they don't need to run simultaneously, then the robot can run one after each other. You can schedule those, or if a robot goes to run and something else is still running, it will just wait and queue up until a license becomes available. And then, this is a real gotcha. Not only do others charge per robot, but they then charge you per year. You're only renting them, and you've got that cost year after year, and then you need extra costs to design, and you won't find any of that with Kofax. You get a one-off cost, and there's no charge for the design environment that you saw me build robots in. So hopefully, therefore, you see that the difference with this kind of technology is with that interactive no-code environment, it does allow you to accelerate your business transformation. If you've got an issue that you want to solve, you can build a robot at the speed of thought and see how it solves that problem. And you can still have it centralized so that there's command and control, and you can make sure that those robots aren't doing things that they shouldn't do, but you're not having to pay a per robot cost. So you've got a low cost of automation, and you're not having to have hundreds of virtual machines and all the cost of infrastructure of supporting those. So you get that superior automation of web applications, as you saw me build, that interaction with a website, out of the box, everything being monitored and analyzed, and an incredibly flexible and cost-effective license model. So I guess the takeaway as we start moving in towards the conclusion of the webinar is this technology from Kofax, yes, they have an RPA, robotic process automation solution, but it's been around for 20 years, and it's part of a whole platform. So those of you that are our customers will know it comes with the ability to capture and understand documents, case management, workflow, the ability to communicate with customers and digital signature, the interaction over mobile devices with analytics across the whole platform. And that ability to capture and understand documents is a real game changer. You know, we've been doing it for decades as well, but that understanding what a document is or what a screen type is, and with machine learning, being able to classify, you know, that is an invoice, that is a claim, that is a complaint, that is a change of address, that is you know, whatever process for your organization, to understand what that document is within an email, and then say, do you know what, based on me understanding what that document is, I now need to call 5 or 10 robots to perform activities based on that content, and do that at any time of day or night. And this works across a whole platform. It's got the ability to capture documents and also access data as well. I'm getting a message that there may be performance issues with voice. So if there are, I will just talk slowly. So we don't care if a system initiates a robot and that robot then needs to call a user to say, hey, look, a document's arrived. It's a complaint. I've logged it in the complaint management system, but I need you to have a look at it to see if it's valid or not, because you're a human and I'm only a robot. And if you validate it, then I'll go on and do more robotic processes. Or it may be the other way round. A human wants to call a robot. They're halfway through a call with a customer, and that customer wants to change some of the information on various different back-end systems, and the human can then initiate the robot to go and interact with various different systems and documents and processes in the background. We don't care which way it is, or both, or any combination of those. And as I said, this technology, you know, Kofax, 20-odd thousand customers, hundreds of robots out there, and many thousands of employees. So we're looking at a technology that's been in business for over 15 years, hundreds of customers, thousands of customers with that machine learning capability. It is a real game changer. And I urge everyone on the webinar to engage with us afterwards, where you think of perhaps one or two of your processes that you'd like a robot to be built for you for demonstration purposes, to say, hey, Tim, yeah, that was great, your demo, but that kind of just solved your problem. Could you do this for us? Could you do that for us? How would it cope with this situation or this scenario? Challenge us. I'd be fascinated to engage with your organization, or my team to engage with your organization to see just exactly how we do that, because we don't know what your challenges are and in what department. You know, we don't care if it's in finance that you want to automate or other different back-end systems. So, you know, in terms of a conclusion, there are significant benefits that your organizations could reap. Imagine your organization having that as a case study, the ability to say that 90 to 95% of some of my employees' time was given back to them because robots did the heavy lifting of the mundane, horrible work that people used to have to do in the past. That's the power of robotics, and that's the power of a solution from an organization like Kofax that have not only the robotic process automation product in Kapow, but that it's part of a wider platform in Total Agility, and both have been around for decades, nearly decades, and are integrated together to transform how your business operates, so that you can come from that first stage of digitizing documents past the second stage of automating processes, so that you are at, as I said, right back at the beginning, process Independence Day, so then you can go on to start delighting customers, delighting staff, and in an agile way, improving how your organization operates. So with that, I've got a couple of minutes left of our hour, and I had a question in earlier that I'll just go back to. I kind of started to hint at the answer and then pulled back slightly because I thought it was a great question that came in, and the questioner, because I know them, they might not actually appreciate me naming them, so I'm going to call him John. That's not his real name. And John, don't worry, I'm not going to mention your organization. But John, you're asking, and I can't possibly imagine why, knowing you, how do you scale and deploy robots? That's a great question. Let's imagine, John, that you worked in an organisation that perhaps had been through a proof of concept phase with perhaps another vendor, and let's imagine that your organisation had spent 14 months with a team of management consultants from a global SI. And let's imagine that you'd spent many hundreds of thousands of pounds buying licenses and having people on site, and that after that time, let's imagine that you perhaps only built 8 or 9 robots that are still in the proof of concept phase. Let's imagine that if that was your situation, that you'd be quite miffed off. And that you might want to understand how you might scale and deploy robots. Well, hopefully you've seen from the example that we've given earlier, I guess one of the absolute keys to how you scale and build robots is the first thing you must do is look for a technology that doesn't need management consultants and systems integrators and firms to come in with professional services teams or even your own coding teams to have to deploy. Because if ultimately you buy a robotic tool that does require development, you've got the same old bottleneck that IT have always had the business, where the business come along and say, can we have X or can we have Y? And, you feel like, yeah, you can have it, but it's going to take 18 months, or what other thing am I not going to do because I've now got to focus on this? So I guess the first thing, John, is you need to look for a technology where the user has the ability to build the technology. I had a slightly different question in the last webinar, and they said, who should deploy robots? I believe the person that should write robots in your organization is the same person that actually writes the Excel spreadsheets, i.e. the users themselves, because they know the process, they know the things that they need to solve. I guess the second thing that you need to do to scale, once you've chosen the right technology, is to establish a center of excellence where you have robotic skills, because whilst users with a short amount of training could very quickly and easily, like I have, start to build robots, what they perhaps won't do is think about robots in the way that an IT professional or someone from the robotic process center of excellence may do, which is, as I said earlier, think about what is the happy path, or what is the unhappy path rather. What happens if things go wrong? What error traps should we build within that robot for when things go wrong? What happens if the robot fails and stops working? What happens if the server goes down? What happens if the internet goes down? What happens if the back-end applications get updated or changed? All of those things can be built in as very simple steps within the robot, and indeed, just like I had where I brought in Excel to begin with, can be saved down as snippets and reused. But it's just as well to make sure that someone with a little bit more robotic expertise is helping you perhaps build a more robust robot that is self-healing. We've got customers, and again, I talked about robots provisioning new robots. We've got some customers that actually have robots that watch when things go wrong and heal robots and repair them, which is rather interesting. And I guess the final thing, John, is to have a governance layer. So you saw me in my demonstration earlier promote a robot to live, and you really shouldn't allow that in a real environment. A robot, before it goes live, needs to go through a governance layer where, again, perhaps IT are monitoring that robot to make sure it doesn't break the network or bring various different back-end systems down or ruin the productivity on some system because it's hammering it, almost like a denial of service type attack, but on internal systems. So IT make sure that that robot is fit for purpose in terms of what it's doing. And I guess another governance layer is making sure that it doesn't contravene any compliance rules, or doesn't, for example, go and empty your bank account. And no user knows that they can build a robot that can do that, because it has to go through that governance layer. But in that way, as long as you've got that center of excellence and you've got those checks and balances, deploy the robot builder out to your hundreds of users to start building hundreds of robots. And because there is no additional cost, because as each robot finishes, it hands back the license to the next robot to take on, you're not going to have to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds necessarily in licenses, depending on how many robots you want to run concurrently. Then you can scale robots. What's the cost to deploy? Well, there's no new infrastructure, there's no new license costs, and I don't need any professional services costs from an external. I just need internal people that know what the problem is and have a few minutes to build a robot to solve my problem. And in that way, that is where you'll start to build thousands of robots in a year. You know, that customer I saw in media, 3,000 robots in a year, or as we've seen our largest customer of this technology, you know, producing 30,000 robots in the wild. So with that, hopefully, John, that answered your question. Hopefully you stayed completely anonymous as part of that answer. But I'd like to thank everybody for joining us on the webinar. There is a follow-up webinar that we will introduce you to, which is all about the death of the document management system and long-live content services. And I'd love to have you join me on that in a week or so's time. We'll send you details of the exact date and time of that following this webinar. As I've said, all of today's session has been recorded. So every time I've ummed and ahed or clicked the wrong thing on my mouse, that's been recorded for posterity, and you can laugh at me. But more importantly, all the key points and the power that I've shared with you about robotics, how easy it is to deploy, how amazing the results are that can be deployed across your organization, can be taken by you and shared with colleagues across your organization. And should you want to, and I'd be delighted if you did, I urge you to reach out to me. I'm Tim Miller, tim.miller@twofold.co.uk, or call me on 0118 951 9800 with 44 in front of that if you're outside of the UK. And I'd be delighted to come into your organisation and share with you specifically what robots and this platform can do for your organisation. Thank you so much for your time that you shared with me this afternoon. Until we meet on another webinar at some point in the future, at that point I will say good morning, good afternoon and good evening to you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much indeed.